The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, with me, Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. Our topic today, voting rights and D.C. statehood. We have an ideal expert with us here, Ari Berman. He's the senior reporter with Mother Jones and a prolific writer. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Mayor Pratt. Thank you for having me, and great to join all of you.
So as you look out over the political landscape with all the voter suppression initiatives underway, has there been any other moment in history comparable to this moment?
Well, this moment in American history really reminds me of the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow. We have seen the highest volume of bills to restrict voting rights this year that we've seen since the end of Reconstruction. And I think it follows a similar pattern, which is new demographic groups turn out. The party in power tries to use violence and intimidation and fraud to prevent them from winning an election. And then when that fails, they try to disenfranchise them legally. And so that's what occurred during Reconstruction. When Black voters turned out, they were met by violence, fraud, and intimidation. And that succeeded for a time. But the real disenfranchisement came through legal means, through poll taxes, literacy tests, things like that. And I think the same thing happened in 2020. You had an attempt by Donald Trump to try to overturn the election, try to throw out votes, to incite violence. And when that failed, they decided in all of these state legislative sessions in 2021, they were going to try to legally disenfranchise their opponents, or at least tamp down voter turnout by changing the country's voting laws. And so it's not as extreme as it was during Reconstruction. It's not as violent as it was during Reconstruction, but there are certainly parallels in terms of the approaches to disenfranchisement back then and today.
Wouldn't D.C. becoming the 51st state not only address voting rights for Washington, D.C., but also help in terms of breaking the Senate filibuster and help with voting rights around the country?
I think that DC statehood would be a big help, not just to DC, but to the overall composition of American politics. We have a political system, and particularly a Congress, that is much wider, more rural, and more conservative than the country as a whole. Part of that reason is places like DC that are much more diverse and much more progressive are denied voting representation. So if you had two members of the Senate that represented a much more diverse constituency, a much more progressive constituency, they would vote differently than a Joe Manchin. They would vote differently than a Kyrsten Sinema. And by the way, it only takes 51 votes to abolish the filibuster. You can abolish the filibuster, the 60-vote requirement, with a majority vote. So if there were two more Democratic senators from DC, or two more senators from DC with more progressive leanings, I believe they would be in favor of abolishing the filibuster, just like the new crop of Democratic senators are in favor of abolishing filibuster right now.
Mr. Berman, in history, we have these unique moments, these unique opportunities, and sometimes we seize them for the better and we change, and sometimes we fail to do that. What do you see happening now?
Well, I think we're really at a turning point, and the question is, which way are we going to turn? Are we going to turn in a way that leads to more access to the ballot, in a way that enfranchises more people, that brings more people into the democratic process? That's what we had in 2020. We had the highest turnout in 120 years. Or are we going to go back to the days where we have lower turnout, higher disenfranchisement, more elections that are decided before anyone casts a ballot? And I don't know. I mean, that's the choice before us right now. I believe if all of these Republican controlled states are allowed to enact new restrictions on voting and there is no federal response to try to stop it, then we're going to move backwards. And the question is just how far back. I believe if the Congress takes bold action to protect voting rights, it'll be a lot easier to move forward. But right now, we're at that pivotal hinge moment where it really could go either way.
How do we get the Senate to move on these critical
really
issues?
All on the Senate right now because the House has passed DC statehood. The House has passed the For the People Act. The House will pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act later this year. Then it goes to the Senate. The first thing you need is 50 votes to support these things. And then you need a willingness to try to get rid of the filibuster, because I don't believe any of these bills are going to get 60 votes. And I think it's incredibly naive to believe that a Republican Party that is committed to voter suppression is suddenly going to support bills that would stop voter suppression. Why would they do that when they believe that's not in their own interests? And so I think that really there needs to be a political movement in America around protecting the right to vote and around increasing representation in society. And I think we're getting there, but I think more needs to be done. The fact that the president is speaking out more vocally about these issues, tapping Vice President Harris, to me is a good sign. But I think you need to make an argument to these wavering Democratic senators that democracy is on the line and that this is one of these pivotal moments where the federal government has to step in to protect the right to vote. And also, their own political futures are on the line. The viability, not just of democracy, but of the Democratic Party as an institution is under threat here. Why else would Republicans be passing all these measures? They're not doing it because they believe it's not going to have an impact. They're doing it because they believe that it's going to help them win future elections. So I think there needs to be the same urgency among the Democratic Party to protect voting rights as there is among the Republican Party to suppress voting rights.
Well, you have clarified it brilliantly, and we can't thank you enough for what you do and for being on State of Play. And we encourage our viewers to stay with us as we continue to do a deep dive on voting rights and DC statehood. Thank you so much for being with us on State of Play.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you know, I was born in Washington, D.C. I was a Black girl who was a Washington, D.C. resident, and I had no power. You aren't going to achieve change unless you do a very good job of sharing data and informing as many people as possible as to why change is upon you anyway. So are you going to shape it, or is it just going to overwhelm you? And that is the point of State of Play.
Welcome back to State of Play. We've been fortunate to have some leading historians on the show, and we've asked them to tell us their thoughts about voting rights and DC statehood. And here's what they had to say.
It's like, how do we stop Black people from having the power, the political power to represent themselves in order to choose their representatives? How do we stop the wielding of that power? And in the larger context of the US Senate, there is the fear, because right now they're balanced at 50-50, that what will happen is, because African Americans overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, is that what that will do is bring 2 Democratic senators into the US Senate, and then it shifts the balance of power, and they are absolutely afraid of that. And so being willing to deny representation to over 700,000 people in order to maintain power is what we saw in the founding of this nation, in the writing and the drafting of this Constitution. It is a through line.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that Americans have to get a better sense of what they mean by democracy. What does it mean to be committed to democracy? Over and over again, we see example upon example of Americans willing to throw democracy into the trash bin when it's not consistent with their own comforts and their own beliefs, as it were. It makes no sense that you have Americans in DC, in Puerto Rico, in Virgin Islands, right, without having the capacity to be full-fledged participants in our democratic way of life. So it seems to me that part of the work that has to be done, and this is at a certain level of abstraction, is to get clear on what you mean by your democratic commitments, right? To get clear on what those commitments actually entail, and to understand that it's not just for some, it's for all of us who claim this place is ours, if that makes sense.
The Civil War led to the enfranchisement of African American men in the District of Columbia, and Black men formed with white men a biracial democracy for the first time starting in 1867, elected African Americans to the City Council of Washington, embarked on projects to improve the city by paving the streets and grading the streets and really modernize the city. And that experiment was brought to a halt very quickly by people who were afraid to see self-government in the district, who didn't want to see Black men wielding this kind of power alongside the traditional elites who had wielded power in the past. And so from that, in the 1870s, you get this commission form of government that ruled the city and the district, again, for almost 100 years until the Civil Rights era, when gradually home rule was restored. But none of that fixed, as we have been discussing recently, the problem that the hundreds of thousands of people that live in the District of Columbia have no representation in Congress. And at this point, it's an anachronism. It's something that is a relic of the past and really is not consistent with democratic values that we hold true today.
Welcome back to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and as you know, our topic today is voting rights and DC statehood. And we've got someone with us who is a leader on this issue, and we are very honored to have him, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Jamie Harrison. What an honor to have you with us, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much for having me, Mayor.
Well, the Democratic Party, in some ways, surprised people, not entirely surprised them, because with Joe Biden's victory, it surprised the other party in the election. But with 8 million popular votes, million more popular votes, and 306 electoral votes. But I think they were a little surprised with the Democrats flipped from Georgia and won basically the Senate. So the party is in an excellent position to advance its agenda. How do you feel that the party is doing, particularly given this backlash around voting rights from the Republicans?
Well, in general, Mayor, I think the state of the party is very, very strong. And when you take at the latest polling, we're finding that we are getting the highest number of Democratic Party identifiers in some of the latest polling. That's because people are starting to leave the Republican Party like it was the Titanic. And who can blame them when it's a dumpster fire on the other side? When you got people like Kevin McCarthy, the leader in the House, who is standing in the way of the January 6th commission. And he's more concerned about playing with Mr. Potato Head dolls and reading Dr. Seuss than actually doing the business of the people of this great nation. You know, under this administration, under Joe Biden, we were able to pass a historic legislation to address the COVID crisis that we had in this country. We put money in pockets, people stayed in their jobs, vaccines in arms, and kids back into schools. And we did all of that with support from Democrats in the House and the Senate, and not one Republican supported the effort. Now, there are plenty of them who are trying to take credit for it, but not one of them voted for this legislation when the American people needed them the most. And it's shameful. And that's why I think the Democratic Party is in a much stronger position than we've been in the past, because not only are we passing legislation to impact people, but we're letting people know that it was the Democratic Party who did it and not one Republican supported it.
Well, the Democrats have a slim majority, but nonetheless, a majority in the House, and Speaker Pelosi definitely knows how to summon that vote. In the Senate, we've got a tie. And so in order to get the Recovery Act or by President Biden and Schumer, they had to use reconciliation, as I recall, because the Republicans didn't want to support it. How do you advance an agenda, be it around voting rights, climate control, gun control, you name it, if in fact the Republicans refuse to support us?
Well, it's difficult, Mayor. We all know how the Senate has operated historically. I'm a House guy. I used to work in the House of Representatives. I ran the whip operation for Jim Clyburn back in the day. And so just a simple majority is enough in order to get things and move in the House. Senate operates a little differently. And particularly as long as the filibuster is still an important component of how they operate, it makes it much more difficult. But, there are things and fundamental changes that they can do just to change that. Let's do if you're going to keep the filibuster, let people stand up in the well of the Senate. Let them filibuster until their feet start to bleed and they have to use the pens or whatever to filibuster the civil rights legislation or the voting rights legislation. Let the American people see these people for who they are. Not just phone it in and say, well, we're going to filibuster and now we're going to go off for a weekend down in Cancun, Mexico or something, i.e. Ted Cruz.
Yes.
Let's make sure that these people are standing up and the American people can see them for who they are, that they're blocking the legislation that we all want and we all need in order to improve our lives.
If we're talking about, advancing the Democratic agenda, the Republicans play hardball as reflected by how they packed the court, within weeks of a change of administration. The Democrats need to have more support in the Senate, and the Democrats could have more support in the Senate if we had DC statehood. And it isn't a stretch. It's not a reach of power. It's about 700,000 people not having representation, even though they defend this country, even defended it on January 6th, with the insurrection, have paid taxes all these years. Will the Democrats really, really, really get behind DC statehood in their own interest?
Well, listen, the Democratic support for DC statehood is unequivocal. We saw the strong and unified, support for DC statehood coming out of the House of Representatives. That bill is now sitting in the Senate, and we have almost unanimous support there in the United States Senate for this out of the Democratic caucus. We got to get over the filibuster, and we got to figure out a way to do that, because this isn't about the politics of Democrats adding one or two more seats to the U.S. Senate. This is about doing the right thing for the people who live in the District of Columbia. So you can take politics aside of it. It's about doing the right thing. These are citizens of this country who pay taxes. They pay more taxes than 21 other states, but yet they don't have voting representation either in the House or the Senate. That is fundamentally wrong. And we got to change it. And this needs to be about doing what is in the best interest of the people of the District of Columbia and what's in the best interest of the country. If we're
best interest of the country.
Yes, yeah. If we're talking about democracy and being this beacon of light and for the rest of the world, the model, then this is something that we have to do because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, well, I have absolutely I'm very impassioned about this. I was born in the District of Columbia, born a African-American woman in a community where you had no votes of any kind. Finally could vote for president and then got limited home rule. But this is in the interest of America. And if we're to have a representative democracy, we've got to have everybody who is a taxpayer who defends this country represented. Now, the Republicans play hardball. Will the Democrats play hardball? For example, there are those, I think Stacey Abrams is one who said, we should suspend the filibuster around any issue connected to voting rights ought not the Democrats insist that any kind of legislation that deals with voting rights, the filibuster should be suspended?
Well, listen, I think Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats have to do anything that they have to do in order to make sure the right thing gets done for the American people. DC statehood, making sure voting rights are protected around this country, making sure people have decent and affordable health care, making sure that we address the issue of climate change. So I'll let Senator Schumer tackle that in terms of what he's going to do. But I can tell you what, if I were in the United States Senate right now, we would be that much closer to DC statehood. We'd be that much closer to making sure that climate change is sufficiently addressed. We need the right type of people in the United States Senate helping us move this country forward. Right now, we're not getting any of that support from the Republican Party. They're like a dumpster fire right now, only looking out for their own political interests and political power, and not what's in the best interest of this great nation of ours. And so the Democrats have to do
right. No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. You're right. I'm happy to hear it.
Yep. Well, and the Democrats have to do everything that they can within their power, because, Mayor, what we don't want is, history is going to look back on how we have lived and all that we have done. And this is going to be an interesting time for the history books. And the question is, when our democracy was on fire, when Rome was on fire, what did you do? If you're in the United States Senate, what did you do? If you're in the United States House, what did you do? If you're just an activist on the ground, what did you do in order to defend and protect our democracy? And that's something that we're all going to have to answer.
We're very pleased that you're here. We're very pleased for your insights on State of Play.
Thank you.
Welcome back to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt. With me, Karen Tramontano and the Reverend Mark Thompson. The topic today, voting rights and DC statehood. We have the perfect guest, LaTosha Brown. She's a community activist, a political strategist, and co-founder of Black Voters Matter. What an honor to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here today. Thank you.
So Black Voters mattered in 2020, and if so, how so?
We made a difference around the outcome of the election. We made the difference in the outcome in the presidential election and in the Senate races. And so I think, if anything, we've shown the leverage of our power and the leverage of what happens when we turn out in record numbers.
Well, Republicans clearly noticed, Ms. Brown, that Black voters made a huge difference in the 2020 election. And now they are working state by state to enact voter repression laws. How is your organization going to be handling this challenge?
Well, we've decided that we're going to organize. I think of it in three buckets. We're going to organize around the community. And so we've been doing a lot of community outreach, working with organizations and groups throughout Texas, Georgia, Florida, throughout the nation that are pushing back on this. Secondly, that we would actually organize the coffers, that we launched a corporate campaign to put pressure on corporations to actually stand with us and to stand against voting rights, and also pressure in the court. So we filed several lawsuits to actually against the states. We're currently suing the states that have actually passed voter suppression laws right now. And so we believe that the way that you build power is you have to organize, and you have to organize that power. Organized power is realized power.
Has also added the issue, thankfully, of DC statehood to its priorities, correct?
That's right. We think that the DC statehood issue is the embodiment of voter suppression. Here you have millions of people who are being denied their right to vote. There's taxation without representation. And so we believe that this is a part of the larger struggle that we have of protecting voting rights in this country, and that DC deserves statehood by the nature of, you've got citizens that are in the district that are paying taxes, that are actually more citizens in that country in several states in this nation currently.
And, D.C. statehood certainly matters for those of us who were born in Washington, D.C. But why should D.C. statehood matter to constituents everywhere across America?
It's such an excellent question. It's kind of like the question that, Georgia has always been a state that hasn't been in play, and oftentimes in the presidential election is like, oh, that's one of those states in the South. We found ourselves earlier this year where everybody was holding their breath on, oh my goodness, what is going to happen in Georgia? That's because what happens in one state, what happens in one area actually impacts all of us. And so in DC, I think the relevance is a couple of things. One, I think what you're seeing in DC is that to not have people in DC represented, right, literally in itself, that is that weakens democracy. That I think that as a part of us strengthening democracy, of making sure that we have representation. The second thing is there's implications that you have communities of color that are actually being shut out of this process. And I think part of this debate of DC statehood is primarily centered around it is a community, is a city that is a majority minority city. And so that a lot of the attempts to continue to actually marginalize our voice. And then the third thing is DC participating in the process will have implications around having a U.S. senators that represent a broader base of people that can actually create a broader voice for all of us around the nation. It has implications on not just on state and local policy, but also on national policy going forward.
Yeah.
Ms. Brown, you talk about your organization being a 365-day-a-year organization. Tell us more about what your organization and what you do on the non-election days to organize.
Yeah, that part of what we think has been disheartening around why we see less than, oftentimes in elections, you have 50% of the population that don't even bother to engage in the election process. And so for us, we know that it is important that part of the way that you strengthen democracy is that you have to increase engagement. And in order to do that, that is a job that you have to do 365 days out of a year. It has to be centered around people actually having a vision where they center themselves, not just about an election cycle. And so for us, our work has been centered around how do we engage communities year-round in local elections? How do we work around issues, policy issues, referendums, things that actually impact people actually feeling a sense of their power? Oftentimes it's hard to get people to get excited about a presidential election and they've lost control of their local school board. Local elections also matter, and they often happen. There's no such thing as an off year. And so for our work, that's part of our work. Our work is doing a couple of things. One, centering people as that their power is important. And then two, literally recognizing that this is ongoing work because it's not just about elections. It's around how do we build power and representation and a government that will be reflective of the people that make up this nation.
How do you get the Democratic Party, all of its leadership, to be as energized as you are and Black Voters Matter is around these issues of voter suppression, voting rights, etc.?
There's a couple of things that we've done this year. One of the things that we organized was centered around a freedom ride. That one, we wanted to organize in local communities to make sure that we let elected officials in their home areas know that this is an important issue for us. This is a key priority issue, and to put pressure. What I've seen that works with anybody, whether they're Democrat, Republican, but people that are in political office, is that you have to organize the power to let them know of what it is that you care about and what you feel is a priority. And so for us, part of it is in making sure that we're always not just having a campaign that's centered around a federal election, but that we're locally based, that we're building the infrastructure and out the ecosystem of organizations and groups that actually will help hold the political parties accountable and set in motion the kind of agenda that the people want. So that in fact, that it's not just about a person being elected, but it's around how are we governed, what policy governs us, and who do we elect to govern us. I think we're at a perfect storm. Having last year where we saw the largest political protest ever in the history of this country, on the backdrop where there was a whole generation of people who have been activated now. Once it's been open, you now have a generation of folks that the baby boomers are not the majority of the electorate anymore. Now you have a younger generation that have been activated. And so what I think going forward, these voter suppression tactics, they are certainly going to be catalytic. And I believe that we can actually getting people engaged in this process of not just saying we're going to fight voter suppression, but that we're going to demand that democracy is not just aspirational in this country, but in fact that it's achieved as is laid out in the Constitution.
But one always needs grassroots organizers, people with passion and focus and a strategy. And therefore, we can understand how you had such an impact in 2020. And those who are really excited about DC statehood are excited that Black voters matter, appreciate that it's a critical element within this arsenal. What an honor it's been for State of Play to have you here, and we thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being a part of State of Play.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me is Karen Tramontano. And as you know, our topic today is voting rights and DC statehood. We have with us now a perfect guest. He is indeed the senior senator from the great state of Illinois, as well as the Senate Majority Whip. What an honor to have you with us, Senator Durbin.
Well, Madam Mayor, it's great to be with you this morning, and I know your program is going to address some issues that we're all very concerned about.
Well, let's begin. I mean, we know that the president and the Democratic Party have a very ambitious agenda, climate change and infrastructure, etc. In that environment, and given the position of Mitch McConnell of almost battling everything, even a January 6th commission, does DC statehood stand any chance on that agenda?
No. I hate to be so blunt about it, but no. And I'll tell you, it reflects a rather serious situation across the country. I held a hearing as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee 6 weeks ago, and it was entitled Jim Crow 2.0. The Republicans blew their stack over that title, but I picked it. I knew it would be provocative in one respect, but I think it is totally accurate. What is going on across the United States is an effort by the Republican Party in legislature after legislature to restrict the voting rights of Black and brown voters, expressly because of the impact that they had in the last election. And they make no bones about it. They don't apologize for it. And they're doing things that will limit the opportunity for people to vote, period. And I'm not talking about stopping fraud. We're all for that. But there was little or no evidence of that in a national election involving 150 million voters. So, we really don't need to move in that direction. I would say the thing that troubles me the most, it really does, is the fact that there aren't leading Republicans stepping up and saying, this is wrong. The party of Abraham Lincoln, a party which has a rich history of standing up for African Americans and opposing enslavement, is now taking the opposite approach. And restricting those votes, and with impunity. It doesn't appear that there's any force within their party that is really militating against that.
Senator Durbin, given what you've just described, what are the chances of any voting rights legislation getting through the Senate?
Well, slim, but not impossible. And the reason I qualify it is Lisa Murkowski has spoken on this issue, and I'm encouraged by that. Now, that's a long way from 10 Republican votes, but at least we have one Republican who is vocal in her support for some form of voting rights. We want to call a hearing on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and it would be an effort to blunt the impact of the Shelby County decision. So there would be pre-clearance when states make decisions on apportionment, for example. That is not totally sufficient. We need to do more. That's why I support H.R. 1, S1, the For the People Act, that would establish basic voting rights across America. But at least we have a bipartisan conversation, as thin as it may be, for the possibility of a Voting Rights Act passage.
Well, Senator, does it not appear that the filibuster is the only path forward? And what chance does that have? At least amending it to some extent.
Well, I would hope that we would amend it, because when it reaches a point where the most fundamental things cannot be considered in the Senate, we really have taken away the power of that body. The filibuster was so rarely used in history. It was used at historic moments like the Civil Rights debate in the 60s. Many of us still remember. I was a college student at the time. Neither of you were born. But in that experience, the filibuster was the obstacle. And the 67 votes to override the filibuster was amended to 60 votes in the heat of that debate over civil rights and voting rights. So it isn't impossible to consider modifications of filibuster. But in terms of changing or abolishing the filibuster in a fundamental fashion, we need all 50 Democratic senators on board for that and the support of the chair, which we, of course, have with Vice President Harris. But, at this point, I think we ought to consider modification if necessary, and I think it is necessary.
Senator Durbin, let me probe a little further. You need 50 votes for any modification of the filibuster. Can you get 50 votes?
Good question. And Joe Manchin of West Virginia has been very upfront about his reluctance to eliminate the filibuster. He refers to former Senator Robert C. Byrd, who was the patriarch of the Senate when I arrived and literally decided the rules of the Senate. But if you read his biography closely, you'll see he made exceptions when he needed to. And I hope Joe Manchin will be sensitive to that as well. I might also say that I sat down with Byrd once and said, as you look at your career, what do you think? He said, I had 3 bad votes, and one of them, incidentally, was civil rights. So, to look to him for leadership in terms of modeling the future of the Senate, we ought to be sensitive to the fact that even he was self-critical.
Senator Durbin, are you optimistic about the Biden agenda getting through the Senate? And if so, how will it get through the Senate?
We've done a lot, and we can do more. And thank goodness we have Joe Biden as president, because his values really mirror mine to a great extent. And I think his agenda is the right one for America. And we have been able to pass some things. The American Rescue Plan is a good illustration of it. I think there will be an infrastructure bill, but I think we are building up to a reconciliation package. And those viewers who follow the Senate closely know that means that we don't have to worry about 60 votes. A majority will do, and the vice president's available to make that majority. So I think we can see the passage of major elements of the Biden agenda under reconciliation. It's an elaborate process, but it's not impossible. The Trump tax plan passed under reconciliation. So when it comes down to fundamental political issues, the reconciliation process can work.
Well, Senator Durbin, can you outline some of the big ticket initiatives? I think you said infrastructure could be enacted in spite of the filibuster. I ask that question because Republicans are shameless in exercising power, as reflected by their pushing their members, candidates on the Supreme Court. Should not Democrats be just as shameless in the short time we have?
I think I wouldn't use the word shameless. I think we can demonstrate that the process can bring quality individuals to the federal judiciary for lifetime appointments. We recently had a nominee, Judge Jackson, for the DC Circuit, who's just an extraordinarily talented woman. And I think she has a good chance of being approved. And we've got to stick with quality candidates to fill the vacancies. There are 100 vacancies in the federal courts across America. Shame on us if we don't fill them with good people who can serve this nation well, and we can be proud of nominating. I think Joe Biden is on that, and as chairman of the judiciary, I am too. I see we're closing here. I want to make sure that I mentioned a couple things. First, my friend and chairman of the crime subcommittee on judiciary, Cory Booker, is working night and day on a new policing law that could be extraordinary if we get it done. Fingers crossed, we're moving toward that goal. And I think we have a chance to reach it in the memory of George Floyd and in pursuit of justice in our policing.
Well, we're very hopeful with the initiatives that you think that the Democrats can enact in spite of the resistance or the very obstructionist view taken by McConnell. We're still hopeful that DC statehood, which would ensure that the Senate has 2 safeties in terms of their margins, can also be a part of that agenda. But you've certainly enlightened us, and we are all the better and richer for it. Thank you so much for your leadership, Senator, and thank you for being a part of State of Play.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
I think I always wanted to make a difference. I wanted to go into government to have a broader impact than I could have ever had as a litigator. I had in the Clinton administration a really broad reach on public policy issues. Hopefully, I can bring some of that experience to State of Play.
I want to be clear to your listeners and viewers. I support DC statehood. I can't remember a time when I didn't. I went to college and law school in DC. I arrived as a sophomore in college at Georgetown in 1963. So I have been in this city for a great part of my life. And I believe it's only fair that people have statehood and all the rights any other state has when it comes to representation. But I don't think it is realistic to move that way, because I think the Republicans view that as 2 Democratic votes in the Senate if DC has statehood. And until they believe that that is not a negative, I think they're going to resist it at every turn. So it means getting all 50 Democratic senators behind it. And of course, Vice President Harris being available for a tie-breaking vote. And that is a big ask. We have several key issues. And if we can't pass a January 6th bipartisan commission investigating that insurrectionist mob that President Trump turned loose on the Capitol, you can see how much of an uphill climb we have.
Welcome back to State of Play. Karen, Mark, and I have had very rich conversations around the issue of voting rights and DC statehood. DC statehood and voting rights, they're practically inseparable. And what we heard from the Democratic political leadership is that they care deeply about voting rights, DC statehood, but not so certain that they could make it happen in this political climate. But we also heard from the activists, they don't want to hear that. They're determined that these initiatives must happen now. And everybody says the Republicans are absolutely clear. They're going to hang on to their power by whatever means necessary. So it would appear to me we're in store for a lot of political unrest in our country in the days ahead.
We're at a moment in time where a choice has to be made. And we have to make the right choice. We have to make the right choice for our country. And that means we all have to engage, not just the activists, but everybody who cares about the direction of our country. You know, I was heartened to hear Ms. Brown and what her organization is doing 365 days out of the year. They're not just waiting for elections. And we can't either. You know, we are right now looking at critical legislation, not only making DC a state, which is, in my view, essential, but also Voting Rights Act. We're looking at those pieces of legislation sitting in the Senate. Why? Because the balance of power is off in the Senate. It does not reflect the will of the people. It does not reflect a majority of the people. And we have to take it back. We have to claim our power. We have to fight for our rights. We can't wait and take a breath because the other side is moving with clarity and clarity of purpose. And we have to do the same thing. And if we don't, shame on us.
Given the position of the Republican Party, very clear about asserting their power, given the back and forth within the Democratic Party, not so certain they're willing to do everything they must do, and given the activist point of view, I'm going to quote from, what is it all about, Eve? Fasten your seatbelts. We're in for a rocky ride. So we've got some really interesting days ahead, and I'm glad we talked about voting rights, DC statehood on State of Play.